thank you very much for attending this post-show discussion. I'm Carol Rutter. I'm from the University of Warwick. I'm very, very happy to be back in the city of my father's birth for this occasion. And I have sitting with me three practitioners. The director, Yvonne Murphy, who was here in Cardiff last year directing an all-female Henry VI that followed on from her Richard III of the previous year. Hannah O'Leary, who played the king in that Henry VI, and Lisa Zara, an actor who has played Cymbeline in that role, Imogen that cross-dresses. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the idea that is central in this film of Hamlet that actually has a very long history. The cross-casting of Hamlet as a woman goes back more than 100 years. A wonderful book called Hamlet as a Woman by my colleague Tony Howard charts some of that history, points out that the first Hamlet on film was a woman, the first Hamlet in radio was a woman, and that at periods of crisis, political crisis, social crisis, Hamlet returns to us as a woman. So it's really interesting that what Sarah Franklin was doing at the Royal Exchange in Manchester has a long history, but I wanted to ask the practitioners to begin with to say something about their own practice. Now, Yvonne, what is it that you're doing when you decide that you want to create an all-woman production of a Shakespeare play? What is it that you're trying to release when you do that?
So I went on a journey where I did a lot of research about women and equality, not just in the theatre industry, but it came to my attention through lots of different strands that our industry is one of the most unequal. And so I decided to do something positive about that and take some affirmative action. So I decided to create an all-female ensemble, and I did a big R&D first of all to find out what that should be and how we should do it. Really to raise awareness with the public, but also within the industry. So I didn't just have women playing the parts, everyone in my whole creative team was female. And I wanted to do it because unless we take the time and energy to do things differently, we will always get what we have always had. So there are no villains in the fact that we have such inequality. It's just that people have their lists that they've compiled over time. So they work with good lighting designers, they work with good production managers, they work with excellent sound designers, and quite often they are predominantly male. And so when I asked people for a production manager or a voice coach, I was given 3 men for every woman that I was given. Even though I specifically said on an email to places like the RSC, who were incredibly supportive, you know, I need a female voice coach, I got 3 men back. When I asked people, you know, big theatres here and outside of Wales, I need some female production managers, I got lists of men. And not because people were being, you know, mean, just because those were on their lists and they didn't see what I was writing in the email.
But also, of course, dealing with Shakespeare, you're dealing with a playwright who is highly male-dominant because of the culture and the conditions of his own industry in the 1590s. But you weren't shy of taking on plays that were themselves testosterone-driven, Richard III and Henry VI, right? I mean, you weren't going to mess around with girly Shakespeare.
No, I was really shy of doing it. I did an R&D, and I thought, what do I do to get people into the theatre who don't normally go and see Shakespeare? So I'll do a comedy, right? Because that'll get people in, people like a comedy. And I went and listened to Vicky Hayward talk about how she turned the RSC around with Michael, and she talked about the fact that they put all the tragedies on to begin with, because that's what got bums on seats. So that got me thinking. And then I did a large piece of R&D with all the actors, and I kept thinking that I was going to do something that wasn't male-heavy, because I was scared. And then I realised that I was scared, and I did a lot of reading, and I realised that a lot of female directors don't get chosen to do the histories, and they don't self-elect to do the histories. And I had actors in the ensemble in the R&D saying, if you really want to do this, then you have to give us parts that we would never get anywhere near.
Okay, so let's ask the actors then. Do you think that there's a new wave of cross-casting in Shakespeare? Is it something that you experience? I mean, 20 years ago when Fiona Shaw was playing Richard II at the National Theatre, there was huge amount of press attention that was bizarre in the way it was travestying what Deborah Warner and Fiona Shaw were doing there, mocking the experience. Do you think now, with the kinds of things that Philip Lloyd is doing at the Donmar, or indeed Yvonne is doing, is there a new wave of just normalizing the idea of cross-casting Shakespeare in these plays? And what is it that you as actors, what is it that's released for you as actors when you get to play Henry VI? Hannah?
Well, like Yvonne said, that's just a role that you never think that you had to have a chance to play. You would never just have a chance to say those words, all that poetry. When you audition for drama school, when you go to drama school and do Shakespeare and all sorts of other classical texts, you don't even contemplate looking at those speeches. So to have a go at doing those characters who are not just thinking about the gender and where they fit in with the male characters in the play, the wife or the daughter and that sort of thing. I mean, it's difficult. It creates lots of challenges, but it's also really freeing, I think, as well. There's some kind of liberation about just being able to focus on that character and what the words, the poetry, that kind of
Is your experience of working in an all-female rehearsal room different? And I think, Lisa, you've had the experience of being the only woman in an all-male rehearsal room. Can you talk a little bit about the experience of Lisa first, about that being the woman in the room?
It's really funny because I remember it wasn't in a Shakespeare play, it was in The Kite Runner. And I remember a lot of people saying to me, oh, 12 men and just you. Are you dreading it? Why? Why are people saying this to me? And actually, it was a wonderful experience. It was fantastic, and I felt quite empowered actually being the only woman in this Middle Eastern piece and playing every female part in it. And yeah, I really enjoyed the experience. But I have also worked in an all-female company too, and again had a brilliant experience and in a different way. But I think going back to seeing a female take on a male part in Shakespeare, I haven't done that myself because Imogen disguises herself as a man. But I've recently done a film, 12th Night, where the actress Sheila Tim played Viola and she played Sebastian, because we could do that in film. There was a way of us doing it. And it was wonderful to watch because the changes that she made were so subtle, but it was different. Viola was very different to Sebastian, but it was just amazing to see that she did it on her own. We didn't need we didn't need a man there. We didn't need another character. And when I've spoken to her about it, she said it was just, she was able to explore both, the brother and the sister, and the experiences they both had in that play. And that's quite extraordinary, I think. So yeah, that's my experience of an actress playing both roles.
And Hannah, your experience of that rehearsal room?
I've worked in a couple of, two different all-female productions, and I've sort of been thinking about this a lot. I don't know, like, tangibly what the difference is. I know that in that all-female Henry VI that we did was just a generous, open, really giving rehearsal room. Now, whether that was because it was all female or not, I don't know. But there is a sense of a shared experience, and I suppose we're going into that production knowing that it's something exciting that we're doing and something important, as well as just doing a play, which is always exciting.
But you were also working in a very tight ensemble, weren't you?
Yes.
So that the power sharing was not as hierarchical, perhaps, as in a normal Shakespeare rehearsal room. Would you say that?
Yeah, it was very equally. But status is an interesting thing as well, because status very much comes into gender, I think, and the way you perform status, depending on masculinity and femininity. So that definitely came to the rehearsal room.
Well, maybe we could turn our attention to what we've been seeing here on the screen. And in this film, in this production, this theatre production that was at the original stage of the Royal Exchange, there were two kinds of gender swapping going on, correct? So there was gender blind, let's say, gender blind casting, So we all read, is this correct? We all read Hamlet as a man. Maxine Peake is playing Hamlet, but he is the son, and we read Hamlet as a man.
I'm not sure I read it as a
I didn't read
man.
that.
I read it as
No?
a male, but I'm not sure I read it as a man.
Okay, maybe we can talk about the difference between those. But just again, to make things simple here, there was actually some cross-casting, so that we saw Polonius. We saw the player king cast as the player queen, but also then playing the part of the king, where the male played the part of the queen. Yes? Okay. We saw those kinds of gender movements going on. The gravediggers were both very clearly women and called women, and gendered women. Okay. So in terms of what we're looking at in this performance, I guess my big question is, does it matter? What matters? Do we read gender differently in cross-casting? What's going on in what it is that we're looking at on this screen?
I don't think it matters. Sorry.
No, carry on.
I think it's, you start watching it, you recognise that, and then you just listen to the story and listen to the actor play the part. I really do believe that. I think...
So it's to regender the role, say Polonia, simply to redistribute the parts so that women get more of the heavyweight Shakespeare roles to play. Is that what's going on?
Yeah.
Or is there actually a change in the story that's being told if Laertes and Ophelia have a mother, and maybe this is where something that you'd like to explore, where you have a mother relationship to these two children, as opposed to a father relationship?
I think that does change the story, and I don't have a view on whether that's good or bad. I think that what's interesting is in the playing of it and how that comes across. But I think if you make a conscious decision to change the gender of a character, then that is going to change the story. I think that what I found really fascinating in my research, and we talked to people all over the Cardiff City Centre and in schools, and I talked to people all over the world about this. No one I spoke to who wasn't in the theatre industry had any issue with it whatsoever, the idea of women playing male characters, so being gender blind. Absolutely no one had an issue with it. And when we watch our kids in school doing shows, they always gender blind cast in schools, because there's never enough people to play, or just because they do it because they think that person would be good or whatever on stage. And the parents sit there really happily watching it. So what I was interested in is, when does it become a problem? When do we start to have an issue with it? And why are we almost having these conversations at all? Because we've been watching men play women in Shakespearean plays for 400 years. And we don't sit and have these conversations. We still don't do that. And we've still got all male companies performing Shakespeare, and we very rarely question it or have a conversation about it.
Well, that's why I think I'm trying to establish the difference between gender-blind casting and cross-gendered casting.
But they're artistic choices, aren't they? To change a character in a play, in whatever way you want to change it, is an artistic choice.
Yes, but you also just went on to say that it changes the story.
That does,
So I'm trying to get at...
But gender blind doesn't.
No, gender blind does not change the story.
No.
But if you take a male character and then regender that character in the terms of the language that you have to carry the story, as in Hamlet, then you're beginning to change the story. And I'm just wondering whether you have a view on gender blind versus cross-gender, and whether you have a view on the kinds of different stories that you're starting to tell with Shakespeare, or indeed at the root of what you've just said is, are we beyond gender in the theatre and in performance? Are we just beyond it? Have we done it, talked about it, and now we move forward? Are we now looking at practitioners who are actors acting? Whether they're actors men or actors women, they are in the body acting a part.
We're getting there, I think, slowly, but that's a huge societal shift to have less binary definitions around masculine and feminine, and actually start describing people as people and not just define them by their gender. And I think that that's a really interesting place that we're going to, and I think that will be a much more interesting artistic place. And actually, listening to Sarah Franklin talk, that is absolutely what her and Maxine were trying to do. So they were trying to make it a gender-neutral performance and a gender-neutral character.
Actors, how do you feel about this?
Well, I think that, for example, the character of Polonia in there was a politician, and I think that character just reflected the fact that hopefully we're moving to much more towards equality in politics and in all sorts of industries. But like, as Yvonne said, we're not quite there. Hopefully we'll get there, but I think that's what that offers. It's just a recognition and a reflection that we're moving towards that, and I don't find anything unusual. It does change the stories because gender interaction is different depending on the different characters and their relationships and that sort of thing. So I don't think we ignore it. I think it's a reflection, and it's there for female audiences to see themselves represented as well.
I completely agree. I think it's really exciting to think that we're going down that road, and especially as an artist, that we don't need to worry or think about that. Yeah, I think I really hope that is the future, and that we are going that way.
I found myself very moved with Claire Benedict's performance as the leader of the troupe, this so wonderfully familial kind of playing company that involved the children, and having the children watch what was going on in that theatre and then become imitators of a theatre that they were seeing in front of their eyes, where the movement of gender was so fluid. But I also found myself very, very moved at her speaking of the lines about Hecuba and the fall of Troy, and that it was suddenly this woman's voice in a very powerful way that was telling us that story of slaughter, and thinking how many times in so many pictures around the world, if we look at Syria, if we look at Europe in crisis, if we look at wars throughout history, that it's the women who are left to pick up the pieces, try to feed the children, find some water, rebuild some houses, so that the men can once again take the boy children off to war. And I found that, just that kind of elision of the feminine with this male story, profoundly important to me in what she was doing.
And actually, I think whether you do gender blind or cross-gender casting, I think that's when it does become interesting to hear those words out of a woman's mouth. You start, I think, to hear those words for the first time. So seeing Phillida's Henry IV,
Yes.
I'm bored seeing Falstaff, I've got to be honest, and the idea of going to see it bored me. And I sat there absolutely riveted, like I was hearing it. I mean, I've studied it in school, I've seen it so many times, and I was like, it was like I'd never heard it before. I heard lines that I'd never heard, because that performance was fresh and exciting, and it was irrelevant that it was being played by a woman, and yet it was relevant, because her whole approach to it and the way that she spoke those words made them fresh to my ears. So it simultaneously.
So it matters in handing these parts to women, to letting women play them.
I think having an ensemble of women doing Henry and having them talk about violence and slaughter made people hear it in a different way. I think it made people hear the absurdity of war, you know, the idea of cutting people's heads off, which, let's face it, still happens now in our world, you know, and talking about putting them on a pike, and, you know, the grotesqueness of the violence that is in those plays. You couldn't get away from the fact that hearing a woman's voice saying them brought something to it, an added dimension, while simultaneously it didn't matter that they were women playing men, as all the feedback I got was it was about the character. That was
Do you want to add something to that as Henry?
Just exactly what Yvonne's saying. Lines suddenly ring and sing differently, because you hear stories of violence and bloodiness in a woman's voice, but also, as Yvonne said, the feedback we got from audience members was that once, after the first few minutes, you just buy into the character. And I think we did that in the rehearsal, that felt like that in the rehearsal room as well. We worked on movement with the movement director of, you know, masculine, finding the masculine in our bodies, in our voices and how masculine gestures might be slightly different. But after you do that work, you are just the character. I don't know how better to say it on that.
And that character is located in the writing in some way.
Oh, yeah,
and what you're doing is releasing the writing. So having those extraordinary speeches to speak.
Telling the story. I mean,
Telling the
that's what
story.
I'm always
Okay,
trying
over
to
to
do.
you. Now let's turn it out to you, and let's have comments from you or questions from you. What did you see? Presumably you're seeing this for the first time. Did anybody see it in the theatre? So everybody's seeing it on screen. Okay, so what was it that you saw that interested you in this performance? What comments would you like to make?
Hi, I just wanted to...
Oh, we've got a microphone.
Hi, oh, this is loud. I wanted to ask a question sort of about, you were talking about making women's voices heard. And what was interesting to me with this production was how Maxine Peake didn't use her natural voice. So she put on a more southern accent for her performance. How do you think that the way that they use accents in the play may have affected, you know, why does Hamlet have to be more upper class seemingly than some of the other characters?
Well, he's been educated at Wittenberg. No, I mean there is a tendency to feel that somehow this acme of the actors, young actors' profession needs somehow to be part of the aristocracy. But let's listen to actors talk about the voice that they heard. Now, I would say I would preface this by saying that all of the interviews that I heard with Maxine Peake on Woman's Hour, on radio, and other programs and so on, or when she was talking about it in an interview and so, she was using her own Mancusian voice. Manchester girl. She was in the youth theatre of the Manchester Royal Exchange. She has a wonderful little declaration in the program about coming home to Manchester and not needing London, and says in that little extract, talks about giving women and giving people their voices in art. So I too was really disappointed that somehow she reverted, she flipped at the same time that she had on stage that youth, and is that youth supposed to then look at that and say, well, as long as I'm playing the players, I can use my own voice. But if I play the prince, I somehow have to make artificial this voice. And I felt, as she was doing some of those big speeches, the voice was going way up here and becoming strangled. Did you feel that as actors? Did it feel like a relaxed voice, or did it feel like a manufactured voice?
It's so hard to comment on the voice. I think, firstly, it's a massive part. I'm not sure what part of the run we were talking about this. She was in that, but to play Hamlet on stage, and to be on stage for that length of time before the interval, I thought was a long time before they had the interval. So yeah, it does take a lot of toll on the voice. It's funny what you say about accents, because I find that using your own voice in Shakespeare is so useful, personally. I've got quite a strong Welsh accent, but I find that if I tried, I have used RP in Shakespeare, I have used different accents, but being able to use your own voice, I think, gives you more of, it just opens it. It gives you more of a range in what you're doing. And when you do get into those really emotional parts where you're using words that you wouldn't normally use in your normal vocabulary, I think you really need to be able to explore your sounds, your personal sounds. So yeah, I think it must be very difficult to then use a different voice and a different accent. But I heard her northern. I did hear her northern.
Yeah, it was definitely northern.
Yeah, even from the beginning I heard it, and especially when she got very gutsy and very emotional in it, I heard it, and they were the parts I really enjoyed when her natural sounds came out. Yeah.
I'm not sure I've got anything very profound to say about it, but I do think that voice is a signifier. It's part of what we perform in everyday life. We change our accent or our voice or our tone to fit in with where we are, and I think there must have been a director's choice or an actor's choice that whatever that character was, they wanted her to remain very upper class and because she's a prince, he was a prince. I mean, and I don't.
I thought Hamlet's choice of best friends then was interesting.
Yeah.
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Yeah.
You know, they were able to do that for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. You know, hanging out together.
But
in the
Horatio
swamp.
was still.
But it's just very interesting. Okay, another question. Yes, here.
I was worried that person was going to have to come running over here. I'm curious. You were saying I think it's great to like give women all those jobs they wouldn't otherwise have, but I'm curious. And you said sometimes just hearing the women's voices say the same lines brings them out afresh. But I'm wondering, as directors and actors, if you're consciously trying to bring out nuances of meaning or new interpretations by having women play these roles. Because one thing I found a little bit disappointing with the Maxine Peake, because I felt like it was exactly like a man playing Hamlet, and I would have been interested to see her play with the femininity a little bit.
It's a byproduct, I think, when the voice giving new perspective and new meaning to the text. So I didn't set out to do that. I set out to do a text that I thought was still relevant and had something to say to us in this moment in time. And it happened, I think, that giving them to women added to that.
You don't want to also have a new interpretation.
I don't like doing interpretations of Shakespeare. What I like doing is letting the text speak to us as an audience. So what I really try not to do is put something on the text and conceptual, and go, this is set in 1920s, or this is a thing in Iraq, or we are all, you know, in a cricket match. I can't bear it. So to me, it's about the text, and it's about letting the text out and telling the story. And I go through a process where I try and release the text and let the audience understand the story.
I wasn't talking about those kind of things you mentioned as much as teasing out meanings that perhaps are part of bringing the text out.
Where I think it might be an interesting place to go with what you just said is if you're orchestrating something, and you orchestrate something with piccolos, as against orchestrating it with cellos, something different is going to come out of the music. And if you cast women's voices, something is going to come out differently, come out of the sound that the play is making for an audience. But I wanted to ask, so the question that you were observation that you were making about the implied observation about this production, I think there, from my point of view, having seen it in the theatre, there were two big places where the film narrowed your perspective because the camera was selecting what you were allowed to see. Okay? And one of those was what the theatre gave you in the relationship between Gertrude and Ophelia, because Claudius and Polonia were the politicos who were making the plots. And the two women then sat beside each other looking horrified at the idea that these two were going to go behind the arras and set up this whole thing, the overwatching scene and so on. And there was a real sense of solidarity between the young woman and the old woman. So when Gertrude spoke directly to Ophelia and said, I hope that you're the cause of Hamlet's illness, that moment of direct speech, the only time that Gertrude speaks to Ophelia, was profoundly moving in the theatre. And the other place was in The Ghost. And here on the film, or during this run of the production, they seem to have decided that the ghost should be more avuncular. In the theatre, when I saw it, he was terrifying. And the ghost was beating up on his child. It was really parental abuse. And particularly in the second scene, in the closet scene, where Hamlet, Maxine Peake was there clutching, Hamlet clutching his mother, you really felt that something very damaging was in the family history of Hamlet that was coming out in this generation, and the imperative to revenge. But because of what the camera was doing, you didn't get to see the complete picture that was available to you in the theatre. And that, I think, made a difference to the stories that the women were telling and the cross-gendered stories that were being told on stage as against the film. So this, I think, was a really good kind of archive aide-memoire, but there were also things that were selected out of this particular performance. Another question? 5 minutes? Another question?
Hello, being a female actress myself, seeing things like this always moves me, always makes me very excited to see females taking on male roles in the same way males taking on female roles. However, we can't do this forever and it still be fresh. So my question is gender swapping going somewhere? Is this possibly the start of maybe scriptwriters and theatre makers maybe creating more roles for women in the theatre? Because that would be my hope. I don't know what your opinions are, but I would like to think that maybe seeing somebody of Maxine Peake's calibre taking on a role like Hamlet would maybe, hopefully in the future, create a buzz and make people think, actually, this lead that I was going to write as a man, let's write it for a woman. What are your thoughts on this?
I really hope that is the case. I think we need to change the lens that we look through things. So I think every casting director, artistic director should be looking through a lens of equality with their programming. I think we will always, I hope, have the canon of Shakespeare to perform. While we do have that, I would like this thing that's happening to become the norm. So in the same way, and I would like to think that in my daughter's lifetime, we stop putting the prefix female before playwright, before director, before lighting designer, before designer, because we don't do it with men. And if we reach that point where I stop being described as a female theatre director and we stop having to have discussions about it because it's so normal, then I think that we'll have succeeded. And when we change, because we're talking about 981 characters in Shakespeare, okay, only 155 of them are female. That's 16%, okay? And only 13% of all of those have 500 lines or more. So if you are a female only playing female characters in Shakespeare, you're not going to get much work in those jobs. So that alone, to me, is a reason to gender flip and gender blind cast. That alone. There is no reason anymore for us to say there's just no good plays for women with female parts. Lucy Kerbel's published a fantastic book as a starter for 10, 100 great plays for women. Every programmer in the country should have it, okay? There is just no excuse anymore that when a snapshot survey is done in the West End, there is 0% of sound designers who are female, or 4% of writers who are female. In the whole West End, that is not acceptable.
A quick last thought from the actors on new writing and who's doing it and what you want to perform?
Yes, hopefully. But I think it is happening, and I think we're talking about it. Things are happening all the time. We're becoming more aware of it. There are more female writers, but as Yvonne said, hopefully at some point they just become writers.
So we need to add another practitioner on the end here.
Yeah, and we've got passionate directors like Yvonne and people that I've met, and it's lovely. And we're strong as female artists, I think, and we are pushing this. And I think it is happening. It is happening.
And my next show is not all female. My next show is 50-50.
I thought you
That's
said
the
it's all
utopia,
women.
right? That's the utopia.
But it's also, I think, the case as women get positions of power as directors and visibility, then they can start to commission women to write. So the last person we need down here, the invisible person down here on the end, is the writer, who we also need to ask about this. And so maybe we'll come back in a year's time and revisit this question. Hope to see you all, and thank you very, very much for coming tonight.